different aspects from the beginning of the technology, talking about the technology and how it's applied, and then going through some of the more general aspects, defining sustainability yesterday afternoon in terms of GMO crops. And today then, I'm going to talk a little bit about risk analysis as a framework for evaluating the sustainability of products. So what you should recognize, then again, obviously we're going to talk a little bit about the framework itself, and then you will recognize the things like food and feed safety, environmental safety, and then also, as we've already said many times, we also include socioeconomic things, and then Jill will present that bit on our thinking around the socioeconomic things in South Africa at the moment. So before I start then with the real core of the discussion, I just want to quickly cover some what I call concepts, because as I said yesterday, as you go through the environment and you talk to different people with lots of experience, and over time you realize that there are some underlying themes under all the things that we do. And some of the things that I would like to highlight that you must, these are the kind of things that you should tie to your ear and remember as we discuss details, is things like familiarity. I think sometimes people, especially when they're new to biosafety, they think everything is brand new, we should break new ground in everything we do. And it's not. Hopefully yesterday I already showed you that the concept of sustainability has been around for a long time. It's the same. You just apply it now to GM crops because the regulatory framework requires that of us. And you can also apply this to many other areas. So as I go through the talk, I will try and remember and just highlight some of these things again to you. Then relative simplicity, and then I put in brackets evolving complexity. One of the other things that I realized as you talk to regulators throughout the world is people, obviously when they don't have experience and confidence, it looks like a huge obstacle in front of them. And they tend to go into much more detail, and what happens then over time, things become actually more and more simple. Not because I think the content itself becomes simple, but because you actually understand the whole framework. Remember, we also quickly discussed the system approach. And I think this actually is ingrained into your thinking. As you continue, it's much easier to make those linkages. And the advantage of that is then you can exclude things much easier. And it was amazing at last week's ISB GMO, for example, some of the discussions were on practical things that we will discuss today, but things like the integration site of the transgene and how little impact it actually has. And I mean, this a few years back was one of the backbones of molecular characterization. It's very important to know everything around the integration site. And the argument now is, that our experience with many, many thousands of lines is, if you look at the phenotype, and there's no obvious impacts, really doing the detailed analysis doesn't add value. So you must also, in the back of your mind, realize that you will yourself go through this developmental process. And then diverse perspectives I already referred to yesterday, but it's just the same point. From our point of view, for example, we assist with the regulators on the one side and the developers. But obviously we discuss the same issues, but the perspectives are completely different. And sometimes I think the clash comes not really because we disagree about a lot of things, but just because we have completely different views initially. So we should try and work through those things and get to the core of the matter. And then continued reaffirmation of context. This to me is very important in a risk analysis framework, and I mean I'm going to spend several slides on this topic, but the point is you must always think where you are. And one of the things that really highlighted this to me, as well as the discussion that we had on labeling in South Africa, where we, often you can walk into the meeting and think your starting point is people have the right to know. And from that point, you will argue everything to say, they have the right to know. But sometimes you must just think of it again in the context where you are. What is the value of that knowledge, for example, in that particular context? Is that the overriding thing, your initial starting point? Or should you sometimes take a step back or not? And also in a more practical sense, in terms of what we're going to discuss today in risk analysis, the context from which you evaluate, something that we've already discussed a million times. The context of a small-scale farmer in Zambia is completely different from the large-scale farmer in South Africa or where else in the world. So in certain aspects, it has a big influence. So you should also obviously distinguish between that. Food safety will not be a difference between the small-scale farmer, obviously, and the large-scale farmer, but things like insect resistance management, if you identify that as one of your potential risks, the way in which you manage it is completely different. So I've shown this to you repeatedly. I love this structure because, in my mind, it gives an overall structure which you can fit to both. Remember, we're talking about the sustainability now, so it's not both, it's all three. I think you can fit it to food safety. It was initially developed for environmental risk assessment, so definitely it fits in there. And then even in terms of socioeconomics, the broad concepts, and this is in the next slide where I only show you the four main components. So it's about this iterative process between the management and the assessment. Communication is always part of it. We will end off this talk about a little bit on communication, but then within a particular context, as we said a million times. So the point I'm trying to make is that you can use this framework conceptually for all three of those things, and this is what we're going to try and illustrate. So risk analysis, we've discussed the science-based issue yesterday. It doesn't mean only natural sciences. I think in our context, we are naive if we think it's only natural sciences. We will have to talk about socioeconomic issues as well, because it's part of our legislation. But it should be, we should distinguish between, just opinions that people throw out there somehow. And yesterday afternoon, we actually had a very nice discussion on that. In effect, that is what's happened. Politics overrides sometimes all of these nice things that we discuss here. But in terms of a real assessment, obviously, you need to support it in some way. And again, emphasize that obviously you can get data and information for your socioeconomic stuff as well, and this is part of what we're going to try and illustrate today. And then risk analysis is always done on a case-by-case basis. I made this point also a million times. You can't talk about the safety of GMOs. It's the safety of a GM BT in a particular environment, in the South African Maize Triangle, for example. And then some of that data, of course, is transportable. You should also not think everything in certain contexts, I should reinvent the wheel. I mean, South Africa and some of the agroecological areas and other neighboring countries, for example, if you have information, data in other words. So this is actually the principle of everything that I say is you have an argument and then you generate the data, you make the arguments to support that or not support it. So if I say Botswana's maize farmers will have the same agroecological areas, I must support it somehow, obviously. If I can support that, then you can build the argument to the regulator to say, but that data that was generated outside Potchefstroom, I can use in Botswana, for example. If there's a difference, then you actually use that difference to say, this is the difference, so let's evaluate that difference then in terms of potential risks. So case by case, always. You can't talk about GMs in general. It's an iterative process. I think it's especially clear between risk decision or risk management issues and risk assessment. Yesterday I showed you one of the projects that we supported in South Africa was looking at the containment of abalone. So there you can argue, we don't want to work on abalone because if it goes into the oceans, we're going to transfer the genes to wild species. So then you say, okay, I want to do the research. What I should not do is get it into nature, so then I'm starting to work on my containment measures. So what are those management practices that you should put in place? How far from the sea? How many filters? How big are the tanks that I will allow? And if they overflow, where does that overflow water go to? Those kind of practical matters. That is what risk assessment is all about. It's comparative. We also made this point earlier. You can't say, look at this nice bush outside Windhoek, and then you go on the western side and say, but this maize that they planted here is a monoculture and it's killing all the wildlife. The comparator should be conventional agriculture because this is what you're doing. This is a biosafety assessment of the GM organism and the trait where it's applied. So obviously your comparator is important, especially in food safety issues. We will discuss a little bit of that later. And what you should also take into consideration is obviously the trait itself. This is obvious. I already gave you the example of the people that transferred the protein from Brazil nut, and then they found the GMO to be allergenic. This is an obvious line just to actually prove it in the lab, but it's a logical argument actually. Compare that to something, lots of the discussions now is the so-called new breeding technologies, where some of them will not even be detected in the end. There will not be proteins in some cases, all those kind of things. So this is what you can evaluate the trait itself, or how the trait is induced, because in a process-based system, that is the important point. It's regulated, irrespective of what you can detect or see in the end, but then also the trait. And maybe I must also use this opportunity to give you the interesting example where South Africa has a process-based thing where we say if it's GMO, it's been done in the lab, that doesn't have to access something in a way that doesn't occur naturally. So all of that is managed or regulated. But if you do exactly the same trait, so if I somehow could have bred for insect resistance through traditional breeding, that would not have been regulated, even though both of the plants in the end of the day is insect resistance. But in a system like Canada, for example, which Muffin wouldn't be able to tell us much more, but they actually manage the trait. So if it's a novel trait, so if it's something that's the first time in that crop, it will be managed. Not only crops, other organisms as well. So there it's about the trait. So in my mind, something like that is much more logical because it's about that trait that will have an impact on the environment, if it does, or if that trait is transferred to relatives, in that way will have an impact. Okay, the characteristics of the top crop, obviously, I'm going to talk about this. I think a simple example trying to use that is if you have a crop that's in a particular environment, very invasive, and you add something that might increase its weediness or its invasiveness characteristics in that environment, you might have a difficulty. But if it's, the argument that I used yesterday as well, sorghum is a sensitive thing in South Africa at the moment for the regulators because it's indigenous. And I'm just going to say that. I'm not going to disagree or agree with them. The point is they feel sorghum should not be worked at in South Africa if it's not in a level 3 thing. But if you come in with maize, there's no wild relatives, there's a history of safe use, all those kind of things. So there's a huge difference between, as an academic researcher, if you want to work on maize or sorghum in South Africa, GM. And then the receiving environment, I've used many examples of this. Again, how does it interact? The example I just used of sorghum versus maize in South Africa has a huge impact. And then the interactions between all of these. So the first step we said is setting the scope and interest. Yesterday I also already referred to, that I really think risk assessment is not a thing that you sit in a little dark corner by yourself and do. It must be interaction with people because lots of the things that we do, especially in terms of setting the scope, is determined by a much broader stakeholder group. It's the country, in effect, that does those kind of things. It's not only, and this is where I think, yesterday we also talked about the implicit responsibilities of the regulators in the system. They actually represent a much broader constituency. So, it's a process that includes risk assessors, decision makers, and other stakeholders. And then you should consider during this stage, you are guided by your policies and strategies. Again, I don't have to talk or give people from Africa examples of this. Again, yesterday we discussed this. Unfortunately, these policies seem to be driven by individuals often. So it's not really broad frameworks that are stable over time. And then you should set your protection goals, assessment endpoints. These are now the nitty-gritties of, especially in environmental risk assessment. Maybe I must try and make here a division between the different assessments as well. Food safety is in some respects very simple because, as I said, the main things is going to impact your health. So allergens, toxins, and all those kind of things it's pretty straightforward in the way that you analyze it. Environmental risk assessment is actually, I would say, the big brother of all the assessments. And if you do really a risk assessment search on GMOs, I think the majority of things and theories and frameworks and things will be about environmental risk assessment specifically. So this is something where people sometimes, I think, get a little bit confused because, as I said earlier, I like to use that risk analysis framework in which risk assessment is just one of the steps as the overall framework. But then when you get to the assessment part, obviously for these different three legs of sustainability, it's completely different. And then in the end, we will present, there's actually no clear guidance on socioeconomic assessments for GMOs specifically. So we will give you what our vision is in that direction later on, like I said. So protection goals, coming back to it then to say environmental issues, protection goals would be the broader things. The developer can't come to you and say what is important to protect. You know, that would be a huge conflict of interest in the first place, but it's in any case not their place to know. We will have protection goals as a country somehow, and that should be voiced through the regulators, and it's also developed, or it evolves over time, as I said yesterday, by the input from public and specific interest groups from the anti-GMO lobby to, you know, farmer associations or groups like the potato growers that we discussed yesterday in the three different examples around the world. But then if you have protection goals, one of the frustrations of risk assessors, I think, is when people come and say, biodiversity is important to us. What does it mean? You know, what is the value? How are you going to measure impact on biodiversity? Those things have to be translated into things that are measurable. That we can say at the end of the day, if the GMO was released and then suddenly one species completely disappears, then we can say, yeah, that is the issue. And beforehand, we should have worked back and say, this is how we're going to ensure that harm does not occur. And this is what it is about endpoints. How do you measure? I also gave you the example already in environmental, you know, things like non-target impacts is always a very big issue. So I already explained, you have your protein there to kill the particular pest. But then you can have a hypothesis that says it might kill other species as well, which are beneficial. I gave you the long explanation of the predators, for example, the other day. So now you must go through the system to say that predator, first you must show that it will be exposed to the new trait in somehow, and then you can determine that then as what you're going to measure. So it's a particular species that you're going to count over time, for example, to say it has an impact or not. Risk thresholds, I will talk a little bit maybe later on, but this is just the point to say, okay, that predator, maybe there's an impact, because this actually will happen, because if you take away the pest, there's less food for the predator. So you must also realize beforehand there's going to be a reduction in that predator. But I mean, it's what you should expect. And this is why I say comparisons are so important. One of the things that we found in South Africa through the work that people at Northwest University have done is that if you compare a maize field with the field next to it, there's actually a much bigger biodiversity within the field than next to it, because you created this new, very palatable, soft target for the pests. So you should also then not get hysterical when you see there's a drop in these predators. You must see it in the bigger context of where were the levels before and those kind of things. Management strategies, I already talked to. I must move a little bit quicker. So review the mechanisms. So we will talk about that later. The methodologies, how are you actually going to measure this? I think these are the kind of things that are very controversial within the risk assessment framework of the Cartagena Protocol, for example. The kind of things that they seem to suggest in there are things that the risk assessors around the world with lots of experience feel are completely overboard. So, but obviously when you identify something, you should also have the tools to measure that. The nature of the level of detail and information required, it fits into the rest. I've already discussed this. And then the experience and history. Obviously, when you do a risk assessment for the first time, this GMO will not be in there. You will only have the safe history of the non-modified plant. So what do we know? I already said maize? What do we know about it? Is it safe in general? All those kind of things. But I think the advantage that we often have on the African continent is that it's GMOs that's already been released somewhere else. So we can also look at other safety data from other areas in the world and use it as it is applicable. So risk assessment then, in the end of the day, you look at your assessment points, and if you have this hypothesis or problem formulation stage, which I will discuss a little bit later, you in the end evaluate or assess the risk. And I already said before, there's the first step is problem formulation. So identify some, in the older literature especially, I think people refer to hazard identification, but it leads to some conceptual problems. So I like the problem formulation word to say, like I said earlier, you have the problem formulation means is you build this hypothesis to say this protein, BT, is new, it's going to be in the environment like this insect is going to be exposed to it and it might have this impact on it. This is in effect what the formulation is. And then you characterize, I can never pronounce the word, but you characterize the risk then, which is a product of exposure and the consequence. So on the one side is to say how much of that protein will the insect see. So if you have the hypothesis that the predator will eat one of the aphids, which is sucking on the plant and getting BT that way, you must go and actually show that that BT is transferred to your predator, and then only you can say, okay, it's that BT that's in the predator that might have an impact. And then what is the consequence of that? And the consequence can be on two levels here. It can be the protein is there and it has absolutely no effect, or you can say, okay, the protein is there and it impacts somehow on that secondary insect. So in principle, it's about how likely and what will the problem be, and that leads to the estimate. I showed you that framework before, and it will be in one of my other summary slides. I think it's actually just after this again. And then based on that risk, you will make your decision. If the risk is acceptable, you continue. If it's not, obviously you don't. So again, I already made the point that there's nothing like zero risk. So you must have a look and see if it's acceptable, and here's the framework that I showed you earlier. This is used, for example, by the Office of the Gene Technology Registrar in Australia. There's many people that are very uncomfortable with a framework like this because, they don't like the words like likely. How do you define likely or unlikely and all those kind of things? And I think, I like the principle because it clearly illustrates to you. And I think as you get experience within the environment, these things probably will make a lot more sense. But I've seen matrices like these that included, 2 or 3 more levels on this side and on this side. But to me, it's neither here or there. You can look for something that you feel more comfortable with. The bottom line is you must somehow assess and quantify, if possible, the likelihood and the consequence. And the combination of those two things will give you the idea of the risk. And then after you've assessed now the risk, you must make the decision. And then I think here a few concepts are, general concepts again, are important. So the first point is that the earlier you are in the process, the more uncertainty there is. I would venture to say BT maize at this stage, we know so much about it, and there's obviously a lot less uncertainty than the first time it was planted 20 years ago. So the point is then, if there's more uncertainty, so you don't know what the consequences, in other words, what should you do then to reduce your risk is to reduce the exposure. So exposure, in other words, means you don't expose the environment to that thing. And this is why we first do confined work, then confined field trials, and then we go to the general release. And then you can also manage the consequences by obviously putting some management practices into place. The specific thing there about volunteers is just an example. So, and then field trials. So this is just taking you through the process. I will show you the tiered risk assessment, and then I will describe these in a little bit more detail. But the point is, you do the field trials, and then you generate more data. So as you go through all these different steps, you have more and more and more data to base your assessments on, as we explained earlier. So there's the tiered approach. What does it mean? It means if you're uncertain in the beginning, you do your work in the lab. It also means that, for example, something like toxicity, you will do in a lab which is confined, but you will also do it at levels that are completely, separate from what you will see in the environment in the end of the day. So you determine things like LD50s and all those kind of things, because you just want to get data to support the principle. So if you don't have an impact on that non-target insect, for example, at levels that are hundreds of times higher than to what it would be exposed to in the environment, you can immediately say, it doesn't have impact. So then you don't have to go through this complicated research to say, okay, it will be exposed to this pathway, and I use feeding insects, and I do, an environmentally relevant experiment for that particular hypothesis, because you already showed that it has no impact. So there's no reason. But if you see an impact there, then you can to the next level where you actually, sorry, just quickly interrupting myself to go back there. Lots of these things are then also not, this is in vitro type of studies. So you don't have the actual plant on which it feeds. You will just have some kind of media in which you incorporate then, for example, the protein, and see if it has toxic effects or not. Then greenhouse trials, obviously this now becomes a little bit more environmentally relevant. So now you have the plants growing there, and you test it in a confined trial, but you can manage things a lot better, and obviously you can also manage the containment. So if at this early stage with the uncertainties, you can still make sure that it doesn't go into an environment and have unwanted effects. Then you go to the field trials. You also see every time as you do larger things, and it becomes more and more environmentally relevant. So in the end of the day, this is where you get your information. You say, no, it does not have these impacts. I don't see any large, almost ecosystem-based impacts. You continue. If you at this stage still see impacts, obviously then you'll have to look at other management practices if you want to continue, or you have to decide on some kind of confinement, or issues. In any case, it's risk management issues. You want to say something?
Henny, sorry to interrupt you,
Yes.
but I think because we've got regulators here, it would just be useful to note that from the terminology point of view, laboratory studies and greenhouse studies, we talk about contained.
Yes.
So contained within a laboratory, contained within a greenhouse. And then the next step is confined, where we move into the environment, but we control the release of the GM. And then the last one is general release.
Yes. Perfect. Please, while Muffy is giving the example now again, please interrupt me. Yes, it's another one.
Just a question. In a laboratory or under laboratory experiments, usually what happens there, you control the environment. And in some cases, you may find that some of the traits won't be shown because you are controlling the environment. So what do you do if then you find the traits being shown at the test stage?
You will just explain, because I understand the part that what you do in the lab definitely does not represent what happens in the field.
Yes.
But are you referring to then if you don't see the trait, if you are the developer and you don't see what you want to see, is that your worry?
No, you see what you want to see, but some of the traits are not shown in the lab because you are controlling everything.
Yes.
Then in the field experiments now, that's where it's shown. So what do you do then?
You see, this is exactly what tiered approach is based on. This one, the first ones at the very initial tier, you only look at one particular interaction usually. So if you look for toxicity to a particular non-target insect, you will literally take the protein, you'll put it in some kind of a media, and you will let the insect feed on it. If you then see it dies, you know, okay, this protein might have an impact. But you fed it at very high levels, for example, you put it, like you said, there's no other interactions. Then you go to the next steps and make it more and more relevant. But in that first stage, if you see there's no impact, you know it will never have impact on that particular question. Remember, you only answer one question per experiment. So the hypothesis that I had was to say, this protein will kill this insect. So what I do is I feed it. So you're happy with the part that if it does not die, it's the end of the experiment. I have my answer. It has no impact. If it does have an impact, then you start looking at things like concentrations, for example. You would then in your greenhouse, for example, in there you add a protein, you put it in a media. In your greenhouse, you can, for example, design an experiment where you will have your actual GMO plant growing. So the levels of the protein then in that plant will be very close. It's still not exactly the same as the environment, but obviously it's now much closer to what it would be eventually. So then you feed the insect, you let it feed on that plant and see if it still has an impact. If you now see at these new lower concentrations, for example, if it directly feeds on it, you can say, no, it doesn't have an impact, and then you confirm that later on in your field trials. If it still has a thing, you just continue with the next experiment. So you see, the point is, with all these different tiers, the answer you're looking for is to say it has an impact or it doesn't have an impact. In the end, if you do all the experiments and you still find, this is where I ended up here, to say it still has an impact, then you must find out if you have some kind of a risk management strategy that will, what's the nice word they use for risk management? It will take away the risk? Ameliorate there. So I hope I'm explaining to you. But the question that you have is 100% right.